think we can start. So welcome back, everyone. Now we have our second keynote, which will be given by Frank Pissen. So just a few words for introduction. Frank is a professor in the DistriNet research group at KU Leuven. And over the years, he has done a lot of, from my perspective, very interesting and exciting research on several topics that are related to PriSC, such as information flow control, software verification for security, and hardware software co-design for security. And today he's going to give a talk titled Providing Evidence for the Security Properties of Hardware Software Co-Designs. And yeah, Frank, the stage is yours. So take it away.
Thank you, Marco. Hi, hello to everyone. And well, let me first thank Marco and Jonathan for inviting me here. The field of secure compilation and hence PriSC is one of the most interesting areas in computer security foundations, I would say. It's also an area very close to my own heart, as some of you know. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So what will I talk about? So here's a kind of a 1-minute summary of the talk. What I want to talk about is providing evidence for the security of real systems, physical systems, like an actual IoT device or say an actual processor. So when you have such a device, how can you convince yourself, how can I convince myself that this device actually has some security property? Or how can I convince others, once I've convinced myself, what kind of evidence should I give to other people so that they can be convinced that the device is secure? I hope you'll agree with me that this is an important problem. It's for instance, related to the certification problem. So maybe the government wants to certify certain devices as secure. How do you do that? So for that, you would need to provide evidence that these devices are secure. What should that evidence look like? I don't think we have good solutions for this. And I also hope you'll agree that this community, the secure compilation community and its surroundings, probably can contribute to this. So that's why I thought it was interesting to talk about this. I should say, however, as a disclaimer right up front, that I'll talk more about the problem than about solutions. So I'll try to point out some of the challenges, some of the problems we have to solve, and maybe in the conclusion I'll have some hints at how we could address this. But it's more about problems than about solutions. So don't expect any kind of silver bullets from me today. Okay, so with that 1-minute summary behind us, what will my talk look like? So here's an overview of the talk. First, in an introduction, I'll sketch this evolution in secure compilation to look at lower and lower layers, including now even hardware, which brings us close to physical systems, and which maybe begs the question: and when are we ready to say something about a real system? Then I'll talk about providing security evidence in general, and this will be based on the paper by Hurley and Van Oorschot that some of you will certainly know, appeared at Oakland 2017, I think. And I'll briefly summarize what they say in that paper, and I'll then instantiate this to secure compilation and to the problem at hand. And finally, in the third part of the talk, I want to illustrate some of these challenges. If we want to take some of our results and say something about the real system by looking at the case study, and that's actually part of an upcoming paper of one of my own PhD students that will appear at Security and Privacy this year, 2022. So then we'll have a brief conclusion, as I said, not with solutions, but with more problems. I hope it might lead to some discussions or questions, or maybe even disagreement. I've talked about some of these topics before, and disagreement is definitely also an option. And I think at the workshop, that's fine. So don't hesitate to contradict me if you disagree with some of the things I say. Okay, so the introduction. Well, I don't think I have to explain to this crowd that we build computer systems as towers of abstractions. So here you see one example tower of abstraction layers that in this case starts at a hardware description language and goes all the way up to a structured programming language like Java. In a tower like this, the gray rows here are specifications, and the white rows are implementations of the top specification in terms of the bottom one. So for example, the Java compiler will implement the Java language in terms of Java bytecode. Okay. So again, I don't have to convince this crowd. I think that this is very useful. This enables portability, it enables hiding complexity, it enables resource sharing if you look at the operating system code, for instance. But it also comes with security risks. These attacks that we sometimes call cross-layer attacks. So sometimes, actually many times, you can attack code written and designed and developed at one layer of abstraction, say Java. You can attack it at exploiting implementation details of layers far below. For example, you could do a microarchitectural attack against Java code, right? And this is what secure compilation is. That's the interpretation of secure compilation I will have in mind during this talk. In particular, I don't want to limit myself to compilers. Anything that bridges abstraction layers, that can be a compiler or that can be an interpreter. You could implement a Java virtual machine as an interpreter, or it could just be code. All these things I will use the umbrella term secure compilation to cover them. So it's really about crossing abstraction layers, really. Okay, so if we then look at the field of secure compilation, and we look at how it evolved over the past decades, then I think we can see a trend. That this is not absolute, of course, but I think you can see a trend of looking at lower and lower layers. To illustrate that, Abadi, who kind of kickstarted this field in the late 90s with his protection in programming language translations paper, he was clearly relatively high up this stack. So he looked, for instance, at when you compile Java to Java bytecode, what are the additional attacks that you can do at the bytecode level? He also looked at how to implement secure channels in terms of crypto primitives, and that doesn't fit perfectly on this particular layer, a tower of abstractions, but you could think of it as implementing a secure channel API in terms of a crypto API, for example, and then it would also be relatively high up. If we fast forward 10 years, a good decade, then we see that there's a lot of activity a bit lower down the stack. So I have one example here, which is from one of my own PhD students, but there were several other works. And the focus at that time was, so around the 2010s, compiling structured programming languages to unstructured machine code. And the challenge was, for instance, if you have abstraction mechanisms in the language, something like encapsulation, how can a compiler preserve that? And then, of course, you need at the machine code level some kind of protection mechanism, and Peter Achten used some form of memory access control for that, so enclave-like access control. But other papers like Abadi and Plotkin had a paper where they used address space layout randomization as the mechanism, I think, and there were many others. So we moved a bit down. If we go another decade forward, so then we're today, we see a lot of activity at the microarchitectural level. Even today's workshop, I think there are 3 papers, well, if I count my own, four talks related to microarchitectural issues. And another example is the paper by one of the organizers of this workshop at CCS recently, on dealing with Spectre using secure compilation. So we see this trend of moving lower in this stack of abstractions, and this of course begs the question: how low should we then go? When are we done with this? When are we really low enough? And that's a question that's been asked for a while already in this community. I remember Amal bringing it up in the first Dagstoel seminar on secure compilation already a couple of years back. And my one-line answer to that question used to be, well, you should go as low as necessary to model all the attacks you care about. And in a sense, that's a correct answer, but it's also very unsatisfactory, right? We would like more scientific objective criteria, right? So if you give me a physical device and we analyze it using by analyzing the various abstraction layers and then picking a lowest layer to model attacks, how can we give scientific objective evidence that we have gone low enough for that particular device, or for that particular security property that we're interested in, or for that particular system that we're studying. How should we do that? That's really the answer I'm looking for in this talk. And as I said, I won't have the final answer, but I want to show some of the challenges involved. So one first thing that's interesting to see and understand, and it's maybe obvious to many of you, is that in this tower of abstraction layers that we're studying, the bottom layer, of course, plays a very important role and a very different role. So studying intermediate layers is quite a different problem than studying whether the lowest layer is okay, right? So let me try to explain that a bit. So for intermediate layers, when we're relating layer I to layer I minus 1, we're essentially dealing with a mathematical problem. We have a specification of one layer, we have a specification of a higher layer, and then we have an implementation of the higher layer in terms of the lower layer. And now we can start proving things. We can prove that implementation is correct. We can prove that it preserves certain security properties. We can prove that it preserves and reflects contextual equivalence, or whatever we want. These are well-defined mathematical problems. And even if the specifications are informal, it's still an internal problem. We only need these artifacts, the specifications and the implementation, to study this problem. This is something that in the quality assurance community would be called a verification problem. On the other hand, when we ask, is the lowest layer now a good model of the real physical system, that's fundamentally a non-mathematical problem. Because the real system clearly cannot be something mathematical. We can make another model of it, but that would then just be adding a layer to the stack. And the question again is that model a good model for the actual physical system? So for instance, asking whether indistinguishability as a mathematical concept in the lowest layer corresponds to real-world attacker indistinguishability is fundamentally a non-mathematical question, and is fundamentally something that we can't solve internally. This is what more related to what quality assurance people would call validation. So how do you do that? How do you do that validation? And one possible answer, and I guess an answer that the programming language people in the room, and I guess there are quite a few, given that this is POPL, the answer of the programming language community might be, you can test the model against the real system, right? So that's what programming language papers do. So for instance, you could test the featherweight Java model by testing the semantics against a real Java system. There's a good paper, a couple of years old already, from Sriram Krishnamurti on the essence of JavaScript that some of you may know, where he has a model of JavaScript that's a relatively non-trivial model, but he shows through by testing it against other JavaScript engines that it's a faithful model of JavaScript. So can we do that? Well, the point I want to make in this talk is that in security, and hence also in secure compilation, I think the problem is significantly harder because we're not just testing a system model like a JavaScript model or a Java model, but we're also testing an attacker model, and we're also testing or validating a security property that we formalized. And these two other things, validating the system model is, in my opinion, an easier problem than validating the attacker model or the security property. Okay, so let's look at providing evidence for adequacy of such formal models for security, and let's first look at that in general, and then I'll try to zoom in more on the things we do in the secure compilation community. So first, providing evidence in general. So here I just want to briefly recap a paper that I hope and think many of you know. If you don't know it, read this paper. This is a really, really valuable paper, I think. The paper by Hurley and Van Oorschot on the science of security. So there in that paper, of course, informed by insights from the field of philosophy of science, they distinguish between two different ways of providing scientific evidence. There are fundamentally two ways in which you can do this. So let's instantiate it to the case of security. How do you provide evidence for the security of a system? You can do it in the deductive way, the mathematical way. And there you build a mathematical model of the system, you build a model of the attacks in scope, you give a definition of what security is, and then you have this mathematical problem we talked about before. So here you can give very high assurance, 100% guarantees that a system model is secure. But of course, this can also be some evidence that the real system that you're trying to model is secure. But this can never be absolute, right? Because there is always some underlying assumption that the formal model you build is, let's call it adequate, is a good model of the system. And that by itself, of course, you can't prove. So a proof will give you some evidence of security, but nothing watertight, nothing that is absolutely certain. Of course, also if the proof fails, this can be useful. This may help you find vulnerabilities in the system. Maybe the proof fails because indeed you did something wrong in the system, and then figuring out why the proof fails can help you find that. So this is useful both for positive and negative results, but it can't give you absolute guarantees about security. The other way of providing evidence for security is the inductive way, or the empirical way, or as we would call it in security, the attack research way, right? So what you do there is you spend effort trying to find attacks against the system, and then you go for the real system, not some model. If I want to find a vulnerability in an Intel processor, I will try attacks on a real processor, not on some model of the processor. I can use a model of the processor to help me come up with good attacks, but the actual attacks I do on the real system. And there, of course, if you then find a valid attack, you have a very strong guarantee, a very strong assurance of insecurity. There can be debate about whether an attack is valid or not. I'll come back to that. But well, I think you see, if you find an attack, then that's a hard evidence of insecurity. But again, no evidence of security. So how do you get evidence of security through this line of this approach to building evidence? Well, all you can do is try hard, and if after significant effort by competent people no attacks are found, then maybe again you have some evidence for security. Okay, that makes sense. So that these are the two ways in which science provides evidence, not only in security but instantiated to security, and that's essentially a very brief summary of this Hurley and Van Oorschot paper. So let's look at models like we use them in our community. And of course, I realize we use different kinds of models, but a very common one, I think, is when we model a single abstraction layer, we model it as a programming language or as a calculus with an operational semantics using programming language techniques. And then the system to be defended is modeled as a program part, and the attacks are modeled as a context to which you link the program. And then security is modeled as a program property that must hold under any context, which then means under all possible attacks, essentially. And this is how we turn systems into things we can prove something about. Now, when is such a formal model adequate? As I said, we don't just have to test the system model. If we want to reason about the security of a Java application and we use a featherweight Java-like model, then it's not just, we don't just have to show that featherweight Java behaves like Java, right? It's not just testing the system model. We need to validate the attack model and the security definition we use. And I'll focus in the talk today more on the attack model, but actually a lot of interesting things can be said about the security definition too. And we all know that, and that's actually one of the drivers of this field, that if we model the system at the natural level of abstraction for the functionality of the system, then very often contexts are not an adequate model of attacks. Typically, contexts are too weak. So, for instance, if you would study attacks against Java contexts are not a good model of attacks you could actually do against Java code, of course, depending in what context the code would be running. For example, you couldn't model microarchitectural attacks against Java by just looking at Java contexts. So the secure compilation approach then is to model the system at two layers of abstraction. And actually, the talk that Scott Moore gave earlier today was a great example of this approach. So you model at one level of abstraction, which is a natural level of abstraction to reason about the functionality of the system, for example. You pick another level of abstraction that you hope is the right level of abstraction to reason about attacks. And then you try to come up with a defensive implementation such that attacks here at the low level are not more powerful than attacks here, right? So that this is kind of a prototypical example of what we do in the area of secure compilation. And so this then shows, if you have a defensive implementation like that, what you then essentially show is that, well, contexts here are an adequate model of real attacks under the assumption that contexts here are an adequate model of real attacks, right? So we really just push the problem down a little bit. And of course, this is often useful to do. We know that at this, if we just work at this level and we don't think about the defensive implementation, probably contexts are not powerful enough. So we go down. But of course, we push the problem down a bit. But now we have to ask ourselves, is this now an adequate model of attacks? And how do you check that, right? At some point, the rubber must hit the road. At some point, we have to relate to the actual system. And I think at that point, we are out of the realm of mathematics and we have to use inductive and empirical methods. And then the question is, how should we do that? And I want to illustrate some of the challenges there by just looking at validation of the attack model. Right? So I'll focus on that. As I said, validating the security property is also of interest, but that's for another time. Of course, even if I want to validate attack models, I still need to give you an idea of the kind of system I have in mind. We can do that for different, and the kind of security property I have in mind. So let's pick something very standard there. Let's say that for systems, we're interested in what I call here a shared execution platform for software components. And these components can be processes, virtual machines, web pages, enclaves, whatever you like. So different multiple stakeholders that do not necessarily trust each other can run some of these components on the shared execution platform. So the platform will implement mechanisms for protecting stakeholders against one another. And again, you have plenty of them, language-based isolation, process-based isolation, and so forth and so forth. The details of that mechanism don't matter. These mechanisms intend to realize a certain security property, of course. And again, we have choices here on how to formalize that. We could have unreachability of a certain bad state, or we could have safety property on a trace, or we could have hyper safety properties or hyper properties. I don't want to go into the selection of security properties here. I'll pick one that's commonly used and that I think has an advantage here in the sense that it's relatively easy to validate. So I'll pick indistinguishability. The security property we want is that attackers cannot distinguish two components running on the shared execution platform that only differ in secrets. And distinguishability has the nice property that it's also relatively easy to interpret on a real system. So telling an attacker, hey, tell me whether you can distinguish these two components is an also intuitively easy to understand goal for the attacker. So what is an adequate attack model for a system like that? So when can we say, if we would model something like this, when would, for instance, contexts in the lower layer be a good model of the actual attacks that are possible in practice? So we have to do this non-mathematically, right? Empirically. So we should look at how the best state-of-the-art threat modeling and attack modeling approaches work. And I think one good practice there is to first ask yourself, what are the adversaries we're up against? So it doesn't make sense to talk about what realistic attacks are if you have no clue who your enemy is. You have to know your enemy before you can do any kind of useful validation of your attack model. So do you worry? Do you want to protect against insiders or outsiders? Do you want to protect against cyber criminals or against the government? Do you want to protect against the cloud provider or just co-tenants on the same cloud machine, and so forth? So adversary modeling, I think, is necessary, a somewhat informal and heuristic exercise. So we can't expect that to give us a very hard answer. But unfortunately, even in cases where we can come up with a good adversary model, what I want to show is that even then, one would hope that the attack techniques that are in scope for that class of adversaries would kind of roll out naturally. Once you know what the capabilities, the motivation, the funding level, and so forth of your adversary is, you would hope that you can then derive what the attacks are that you should put into scope, that should be in your attack model. But unfortunately, even if you know your adversaries, realistic attacks are a moving target, right? And again, maybe that's not a surprise to security researchers, but it is a pain in terms of validating models. So to illustrate that, let's consider the adversary class of remote attackers, a very natural adversary class for the kind of systems we look at. So these are adversaries that don't have physical access to the shared execution platform, but they have network connectivity with it, and they can be one of the stakeholders running code on the system. Again, I think it's a very natural class of attackers to consider. So for this class of attackers, what attack techniques should be in scope? What attack techniques should be modeled? So to answer that question, it's useful to look at the history of attacks against such systems. So what you see on this slide is a timeline starting in the 60s when the first shared execution platforms were built and ending last year. And what I want to show on the slide is that new attacks are found all the time. Right, so you don't have to understand all the attacks on this slide, but I assume that you know at least some of them. And what you then can see is that if I ask you what is an adequate attack model for the remote adversary for a shared execution platform, and you give me an answer in the 90s, then that answer is no longer valid in the 2010s, right? Because new attack techniques have come in scope. So consider, for instance, the constant time model, and there you can see that kind of evolution. It was first the program counter model, where we assumed that the program counter leaked, and then memory accesses also started to leak, and then Spectre came and more leaked, and we have to fix it. And if remote power analysis attacks at some point become practical, then the constant time model is definitely not fully modeling what is leaking anymore, right? So a particularly sobering thought is that this holds very broadly for computer security. If you look over the past 5 decades, it has always been true that an attacker who has 10 years of foresight, who knows things that will be discovered in the next 10 years, de facto owns the entire internet. And this can be for trivial things, like if you knew about Heartbleed or stage fright, so these high-profile vulnerabilities, if you knew them 10 years beforehand, you owned the internet. But it also holds for attack classes, right? If you knew about transient execution attacks 10 years before, you essentially owned the internet. With Meltdown, you would have essentially owned the internet. So what we can see from that is that evidence of the adequacy of an attack model cannot look like a proof, right? It's impossible that it looks like a proof. A proof is an eternal thing. Evidence of the adequacy of an attack model is something that necessarily must be evolving over time. And again, I don't have a final answer on what it should be. I'll have some ideas for it in the conclusion. So if we don't know how to do this, if we don't know how to connect our formal results, which I'm not questioning the value of, I think we should keep on doing this, and I think they're extremely valuable. But if we can't connect them, if we can't understand the gap between the formal model and the real system well, what should we do? And what I try to do with a PhD student and a postdoc from my group is, well, take a small step in the sense that let's try to do a couple of case studies. So let's take some systems for which we have a system model with provable security guarantees, and for which we have open prototypes that we can build and actually test and attack, right? And this is what we do in an upcoming paper. So you see the reference on the slide here. And what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is zoom in on one specific result from this paper that I hope will be relevant and of interest to this community. So what I want to look at is the use of Hackelstar in a system called vraced. And what I'll first do is say a little bit about the two things. What is Hackelstar? What is vraced? Well, I assume that all of you know Hackelstar, right? This is one of the flagship results of this community. It relates a high-level specification of crypto primitives in F***, sufficiently high level that you can see that they are indeed correct specifications of the primitive compared to, let's say, the published standard of the primitive. It relates this high-level specification of crypto primitives to a low-level implementation in C, and it verifies all kinds of properties of that implementation, like the memory safety of that implementation, the functional correctness with respect to the specification in F star, and a secret independence property, which is essentially compliance with the constant time model, as we've already seen earlier today, which you can think of as an approximation of side channel resistance. So I will base what I say about Hackelstar on this paper. I realize that Hacklestar is a living thing, and some things I say might be outdated, and I'm very scared that Jonathan is in the room here and might correct me or point out things I say wrong. Please do if that's the case. But so this was my source. I should say clearly that neither Hackelstar nor VRACE I've been involved in any of these systems. So we are trying to analyze and attack them essentially from the outside. What's also nice about Hackelstar is that the paper is explicit about limitations and assumptions, and that's really great because, well, that's one of the things we'll have to do, right? We'll have to validate whether all the assumptions that Hackelstar bases itself on will actually be valid in the system that uses it. Okay, so far so much about Hackelstar. What is VRACE? So that's maybe less well known in this community. VRACE is a formally verified hardware-software system that supports a variant of remote attestation. Again, I base my explanation of the system on this Usenix security paper, and also on the. It comes with a repository that implements both the hardware and the software that you need to build VRACE, so you can actually build it on an FPGA. And the end-to-end goal of the system is to provide what is called secure remote attestation. So you should think of VRACE as running as some kind of library on an IoT device, and offering secure remote attestation of that IoT device. So what that means is that a remote verifier can verify with overwhelming probability that the device is in a good state, the IoT device. And the way in which that works is as you would expect. So the remote verifier sends a challenge to the device, and then a protected attestation service, some library on the device, will compute a MAC over that challenge and over the current state of the device. And the current state of the device, you can think of it as more or less the memory of the device. It's a bit more, well, we'll see a bit more detail later, but that's essentially what it does. And then the remote verifier can check whether the memory was indeed in one of the expected states, and if so, the device is fine. If not, it might have been infected, for example, taken over by malware, and some corrective action needs to be taken. So I don't want to look at the full security proof of VRACE here. I just want to discuss how Hackelstar fits in. And please read the paper. This is an excellent paper, state-of-the-art example of a hardware-software co-design. It's a bit more a systems paper than a formal methods paper, but it does provide a full end-to-end proof of this property. And that end-to-end proof relies in an essential way on properties proven of Hackelstar. Right? In fact, roughly speaking, you could say that the proof of the end-to-end property assumes that the Hackelstar implementation, as it is executing in VRACE, behaves as a cryptographically secure MAC. So this relies both on cryptographic security of the actual primitive, it relies on functional correctness of the implementation, and it relies on the fact that the implementation doesn't allow ways to attack it, like memory safety vulnerabilities and so forth. Okay, so to say a little bit more about how Hackelstar is used exactly in VRACE, I'm going to use this high-level picture that you see on the slide here. So as I said, you can think of VRACE as kind of a library that provides this attestation service. So this is the software part of VRACE. This is an attestation library. What you see here is the real software on the device. So this is the software that actually implements the functionality of the device. That also includes the operating system of the device. For example, if the device is a temperature sensor, here would be the sensing software. And that can then ask this protected library to compute these MACs that I mentioned before. And so this library is really to a large extent just the Hackelstar library with a small wrapper around it to call it essentially in the right way. Okay. Now, unfortunately, the core on which the CPU on which this runs is an IoT level CPU. It's a Texas Instruments MSP430, which doesn't have a lot of security mechanisms. So a second thing that the VRACE does is it extends the hardware with what is called a hardware module. That's what you see here. And you can think of this as a security monitor that will monitor some of the signals of the CPU with, to a large extent, as main goal to make sure that this library can run securely. So this wants to essentially provide the secure execution environment that Hackelstar needs, right? And so where are the attackers? Well, they are in the red parts on this diagram. So the software, the real functionality software of the device, we worry that that might actually be exploited and taken over, and then the attacker would be here. And in addition, the VRACE threat model also assumes that the attacker could control some of the I/O devices connected to the core, and these could even be DMA devices, so devices that do direct memory access. Okay, so let's look in this setting what we should do to use Hackelstar securely, in the sense that we indeed can assume in the end-to-end proof that this implementation behaves as a cryptographically secure Mac. And so for that, we actually have to check that all the assumptions that Hackelstar makes about its execution platform are validated in this particular physical system, right? And these assumptions are actually quite tricky. I have a couple of them on the slide here. So for instance, Hackelstar assumes, so Hackelstar goes all the way down to C, actually C Lite, which is one of the intermediate languages of CompCert. And then maybe using CompCert, you could go even to machine code level, at least as far as correctness is concerned. So Hackelstar assumed, I based myself on the 2017 paper that just goes to C Lite. So it assumes an execution environment that correctly implements the C Lite semantics, right? There are a couple of challenges with that. One, it has to do that in the presence of arbitrary attacker influence, right? So clearly it's in the benefit of the attacker to derail this execution environment. So we have to make sure that the correct C Lite semantics is obtained, whatever the attacker does. And in VRACE, given that the attacker can control the operating system and devices, the attacker can raise interrupts, perform DMA requests, reset and restart the machine. There are all kinds of ugly things that the attacker can do. I put the correctly here between quotes because even correctly can have a couple of interpretations here. So for instance, again, and this may have evolved since I looked at it, but if I remember correctly, the semantics of C Lite is only defined for a whole program with a main function without arguments. So it doesn't deal with interactions with, so and here we're dealing with something that's in nature a library, right? So we'll have to make some interpretations there. Some other assumptions, Hackelstar assumes all code running on this execution environment to be verified. If something is not verified, all bets are off, essentially. Hackelstar only gives us secret independence, and VRACE really needs attacker indistinguishability, because in the end-to-end proof, they want to assume that the implementation is like a cryptographic, like an abstract cryptographic primitive. So this is not an easy feat to do. I think the designers of the system do an honest attempt to realize all these assumptions, and I want to show you to some extent how they do that. So this is a picture from their paper, which shows a high-level overview of the system, where you see the core, the CPU, the memory backbone, and here is the memory, and this is the layout of the memory of the device, and I'll look at what's in memory in a minute. And then here you have this hardware monitor that will monitor some of the signals of the CPU. So VRACE divides the memory in two parts. There's one part where the protected attestation service will run. So this is the execution environment that we'll have to protect. It will run in a simple kind of enclave, and how it's protected I'll discuss in a minute. What's in that enclave is this protected attestation service, which is mainly Hackelstar and a simple wrapper around it. And as data, it has the key used to compute the max, and it has room for the runtime stack, for the call stack. Hackelstar doesn't use the heap, and we can statically determine how big the stack will be, so you can allocate a piece of memory for the stack, so that you can actually call and execute the library. Then The rest of memory is where the real functionality of the device is, but this is also where the attacker could reside, right? Because we worry about infection of the real software. So we have to take into account the fact that the attacker could be here. And in addition, as I said, the attacker could control devices that are attached to the same memory backbone. And then finally, this part is this hardware security monitor that will monitor a couple of signals and that will try to enforce a secure execution environment for the protected attestation library. And just to give you one idea of how it does that, I mentioned it protects this as some simple kind of enclave, and you can see that you can do that by monitoring CPU signals, by, for instance, looking at how memory access control would happen. So what this monitor will enforce is that whenever a memory access happens, so for instance, when a read happens, the read enable signal will be high, the address that is read will be on the data, on the address bus here, and the program counter will be some signal that's monitored, and so this monitor can check that accesses to this memory only happen when the program counter is in this range, for example. That's a typical enclave-like memory access control. And so this is one example of an invariant enforced by this monitor. So vrest actually does a good job. They cover many bases. To provide a correct C execution environment, they make sure the code is immutable, which is in C Lite kind of implicit. They have the code in ROM, which makes it immutable. They ensure controlled invocation, again, enclave-like, by having a single entry point. They enforce this memory access control that I mentioned. They also jump to quite a bit of hoops to make sure that the secret independence property that's verified of Hacklestar will indeed imply attacker indistinguishability, and that requires thinking of many things. Like, for example, I mentioned that in vrest an attacker can do interrupts, right? Because he controls devices and he controls the operating system. And of course, interrupts might leak information about the execution of a Hacklestar routine, because registers might leak, so you can't allow that. So one of the things the hardware module will monitor is that invocations are atomic, are not interrupted. If an interrupt happens during calling the protected attestation service, the machine will reset. Registers have to be cleared on enclave exit. DMA access, of course, has to be blocked to enclave memory. When a reset actually happens, you have to make sure that no secrets remain, because the attacker can reset the device and then execute new code there. So that's an attack you have to take into account. All these things are taken care of. I don't want to go over all of them in detail. Again, I encourage you to read the paper. And yet, when we did our security analysis, we still find all kinds of issues, right? And I just have a couple of examples on this slide. And so the point I want to make with this is showing how hard it is to check that a real system really satisfies or validates the assumptions made in the lowest layer of one of our secure compilation results. So here are some examples of things we found. So one attack that still remained was, despite all these controls on how interaction with this enclave could happen, it turns out that the attacker can actually influence the enclave stack pointer on initialization. And clearly, if you can do that, all bets are off. You can do all kinds of bad things. And this is actually an instance of a general class of attacks that's very common against. So this is not a blame on the vrest designers. Many enclave runtimes have similar issues. And there's a paper at CCS 2019 that discusses that in more detail. I mentioned that the protected attestation service is mainly Hackelstar, but with a small wrapper, just a couple of lines of code, but unfortunately it contains a timing side channel from which we can extract useful information. They do this DMA access control to make sure that you can't get to the key or information derived from the key through DMA, and actually they even verify that the hardware implementation of that monitor is correct. They have a model checker verifying the implementation of the hardware module, but unfortunately the way in which the module is connected to the rest of the system has a bug, which causes an incorrect address to be monitored, and so you actually have the opportunity of looking at parts of the key, for instance. Again, these are just some examples. I want to point you to our full paper for a full analysis of this and other systems and other aspects of the same system. So when I say this, when I point out these issues, very often I get dismissive comments, like, so what?
This is not surprising. These are just implementation vulnerabilities, for example, is a common dismissive comment. But I agree, and in a sense, it's not surprising, and I'm not blaming the people who made this system. But on the other hand, isn't the point of verifying end-to-end security properties at the implementation level? I mean, we're verifying Verilog code here, we're verifying C implementation. Shouldn't we find all these implementations? Isn't that the goal of to find all these implementation vulnerabilities? So something is off, right? Then the comment is often, yeah, but then you just should have verified more, right? Or you should have modeled at a deeper layer of abstraction. Yeah, yes, that's true. But well, first, the deeper layer of abstraction. This is again the how low should you go question, right? If you model it as a deeper layer of abstraction, then how do you know that then there will be no further attacks? And it's true that maybe we should have verified more code, but there's always this. All the examples on the previous slide were actually vulnerabilities in interfaces between different parts of the system that were verified, but then put together. And it's very common in a real system that you want to verify one part with one technology and another part with another technology. In the case of V-Raised, the hardware was verified with new SMV, a model checker, and Hackelstar uses F-star for its verification. And at some point, you have to connect all these things up, and then you can, of course, still make mistakes there. How do we deal with that? And the third comment, sometimes again, maybe a comment from the formal methods community is, yeah, of course, this is unavoidable. Formal verification fundamentally gives no guarantees about real systems. And I agree with that. But then my point, and the point of my talk here is, what else do we need, right? I think we should at some point be able to certify, to give some evidence about the real system. And if the proof is not enough, what else do we need, right? And so let me try to say a little bit about that in the conclusion. So I think in secure compilation, we know very well how to study the implementation of one abstraction in terms of another one where both are well specified. And I think this is an extremely useful thing to do, and several results of my own group have done this. And there are still many challenges there. I don't want to say this is done, but I think this is something we understand, right? The problem of determining when such a layer, such a calculus, such a language is an adequate model of a real system, when, for example, the layer at which you model attacks is indeed a good model of attacks in a real system, I don't think we know how to do that well yet. And I think these lowest layers we have represent a very complex set of assumptions about the system on which they apply, on the attackers that will attack that system, and on the desired security of that system. So I think I hope I convinced you that validating these assumptions will inherently need some empirical work. This is not just about making more models and proving more. There is need for some empirical work here. And the question is, how can we do that? So I think one thing we should do is, I hope we can have more case studies like the one we did, and that will appear at Oakland 2022. But I think we need more. So I think it would be useful to have, for instance, attack research against published formal models. I don't think we have that enough. I also don't think it's rewarded enough. So I think it would be extremely useful to have attack research against formal models of systems that fails. But I don't think I can get that published today. If I do significant effort to try to show that the formal model is inadequate, and I fail, I can't publish this today. Yet I think that the fact that somebody tried hard and failed is the only thing that gives us evidence of this connection of the formal model to the real system. So can we stimulate this more? Can we reward this more? Of course, you shouldn't just reward the fact that someone says, I tried and it failed. Oh, too bad. Give me, publish my work. That clearly that's not possible either. So we need to think of methodologies to do this in a good way, where we can check that competent people have done this, and then that would give us evidence. And I think we are in a moment of time where actually it might be doable to build open source hardware software co-designs that can be reused in practice, and can be relied upon because of evidence of their value. A bit similar to what the crypto community does with cryptographic algorithms. I think they're further than the system community with that. And maybe we can try to work towards it. So that's one thing we could do. Another thing is where the formal methods people could help is to help attackers who want to attack the model by saying explicitly, so if you can make the device do this, then you've shown that my model is wrong. So give explicit goals to attackers saying, I claim that this is not possible on this device. If that's possible, then my model is not an adequate model. So that's what I call a falsifiable assumption. The terminology comes from the Hurley and Van Oorschot paper. I think that would also be useful to have. And again, so I wanted to use this keynote to kind of share with you my opinion on this challenge that we're dealing with, and maybe some thoughts on how to move forward. But I see I'm over my 45 minutes already, so I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope there are some questions, comments, disagreements even. Please do not hesitate to speak up.
Okay. Thanks for the very nice talk, Frank. I think, at least from my perspective, I think you touched on some, let's say, very critical questions that we should just probably spend more cycles about. Okay, so as before, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A session or just raise your hand. Yeah, let's see, I see. Okay, Jonathan, I guess you can go.
Thanks, Marco. Thanks, Frank, for a very insightful talk. I liked a lot that you focused on these aspects at the boundaries that are not always like studied in depth, and where a lot of the assumptions kind of crumble and shatter when you put different systems together. And I'm very happy to say that I have nothing to nitpick on about your characterization of Hackelstar. It was all good and fair. So
I can relax now.
Yeah, I was hoping to have a zinger, but no, I have nothing. My question is, like, a lot of the things that we read about these days for these problems at the interface between subsystems are isolation primitives. Like maybe one of your components will be in WASM, where you have like strong isolation, or maybe you will slap a software isolation kind of discipline on one of the other subcomponents. Can you say a little more what's your take on these approaches, how you see them working out, going forward? Do you think it's a promising avenue?
Yes, happy to give an opinion on that. Well, those who know me know that I have high hopes of the capability approach, for instance. So I think one of the nice ideas of capability machines in the style of the Cherry machine developed at Cambridge, one of the nice things is that they make it relatively straightforward to carry some information about security from high-level software level all the way down to hardware, right? Because things like bounds checks, things like protection domains, encapsulation boundaries, compartments that exist at the software level in Cherry trickle down all the way down to the hardware, where even the microarchitecture could actually know about this security information. And I think these kinds of things will help. So solving some of these cross-layer issues that we see coming back, attacking these isolation mechanisms all the way. So I think any approach where we can make sure that information is shared across the layers regarding security, I would encourage to look at today. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very general answer, of course.
No, it does. Thanks.
Okay, so next one is Katalin.
Can I see the question somewhere, or will Katalin?
Oh, Katalin raised his hand, so I think
okay.
someone has to unmute it. I'm hitting to...
The student volunteer is about to bring up Kathleen to the virtual stage, and then Kathleen will
excellent.
be able to ask his...
I'm still new to this platform, so if I do something wrong, let me know.
No, you're good. Oh,
yes.
There he is.
So I hope this is working.
Yeah.
Maybe let me...
Hi, Kathleen. I hear you. I don't see you, but yeah, very happy to hear you.
So thank you for the very interesting talk, and I very much agree with this idea that you never know what kind of new ways of attacking systems people will come up with. One thing that I'm less sure about is whether this V-Ray system is really the best illustration of this. My impression is that from a formal verification point of view, the gaps in what they prove were so obvious that they prove hardware on the one side, and well, they take a piece of verified crypto on the other side, and then well, they try their best to fit them together so that they get something secure. But somehow they have no end-to-end theorem to speak of.
They do have an end-to-end theorem.
Prove.
And a proof. It's not in the paper. It might be in the appendix or in the repository. But
it's a paper proof or something like that, right?
It's a
very informal.
It's a machine-checked proof in linear temporal logic checked by new SMV. But wait, let me. To some extent, I agree with you. And I. But yeah. Well, let me say the following. I think it's much more a systems paper than a formal methods paper. That is true. And I think they do a best effort at using rigorous reasoning to show the security of their system. And I actually thought, so it's not the only system we looked at. We looked at also at the system that I did my own group, where we also tried to see whether we made a proof of that system had a certain property, and we tried to invalidate it on the implementation. And I actually expected when we started this work that we would do better. But we don't. So we have other issues. So in the system. So what I checked essentially the work of Matteo on the secure interruptibility, the fact that interrupts don't add side channel power to a system that we built Sankus. We didn't find the proof was done very well. I think you'll agree with me that Matteo is a state-of-the-art proof engineer of this community, but we found other issues then. So we found issues where the model and the implementation diverge a bit, and diverge enough that it leads to so the problem is if you make a rigorous operational semantics model of the system, then it will be necessarily a bit more distant from the actual Verilog implementation of the system, because yeah, you can't model all the detail of the real system. So you have to do this abstraction step, and then the question is, have you overlooked things? And it turns out there are a couple of mismatches there too. So again, they're in the paper. So you can go wrong in many ways, and I don't want to say I don't want to point fingers. I think the system building part and the architecture part of the V-Race paper is very good. I think I agree that on the formal side there could have been improvements, but I don't think that would have invalidated the main point I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there are a few talks in the Q&A. Can we start with the one from Dayan?
Thanks, Dayan. Again, these are all dangerous questions. I like that. I'd say the newer the layer, the further we're off of a final answer, I would say. So one complaint I would have, and I already mentioned this to Marco in the past, is that, for instance, in the microarchitectural layer, we're looking too much at just Spectre v1. This is not always the case. We've seen counterexamples today, but but I think there's this work. I don't know it in detail yet, but the people at KTH, I think, have done this kind of empirical validation of leakage models, and they find that almost all platforms they look at leak much more than constant time, and they find all kinds of unexpected leaks. Yet in our models, we seem to be a bit conservative and only look at specific attack techniques and specific leakage models. So probably that is an example of an area where we can improve, but that's also a very new one, of course. Another one that I'm always a bit again, but I don't want to make enemies by by giving critique on specific layers. But what I also always found a bit weird is that the non-interference community dismisses termination and timing side channels so easily, whereas in practice they matter. I'm sure that if I'm an attacker, I can exploit the timing side channel, and they're put out of scope, sometimes for good reasons, but still, I think it would be interesting to also have some attack research on some of these things. Again, I don't know if that answers your question, Dejan. This is just a subjective opinion. These are just examples of things, of concrete areas where I think we can still get it a bit more watertight.
Okay, there is a long question from Peter Sewell. Maybe we can see the first half and then the rest.
Okay, I can see part of the question. Let me look in the Q&A.
I think it would show up later, the other part. So.
Hey, Marco, why don't you read the question?
Yeah, okay, I can just, yeah.
And then we swap to the next half once you've done.
Yeah. For some of the interesting integration issues you were speaking of, one would want to verify the composition down to the gate level, but that functional correctness verification is still infeasible for any high-performance processor and CPU. What thoughts do you have on what people should do before that becomes feasible?
Yeah, very, very correct comment. So yeah, I don't know. So what I'd say is we should first look at smaller systems. High performance processors and CPUs are, I think, I don't think we're ready for them. I think systems of the scale of V-Raised and our own Sancus, which is also based on this OpenMSP 430, which is a simple implementation of the Texas Instruments MSP 430 instruction set architecture. Maybe there we are that's a scale maybe that we can handle. And then even if you go down to the gate level, is that enough? The question is, I used to think that going to machine code was enough. and then all this microarchitectural shitstorm came, and then you think RTL is enough, but if you now look at these undervolting attacks, there probably analog and electronics can even play a role to determine what exactly happens when you undervolt a CPU. So first, yeah, I don't know how low we should go for functional correctness verification. I agree with you that it's infeasible for a high performance processor and CPU. We're not there. My approach will be to focus on smaller systems first. I hope we can come to a situation where these kinds of simple hardware blocks and a software stack on top of it, we can implement and verify and empirically validate to an extent that we can offer open source blocks that can be taken by industry and be secure out of the box. That would be the goal. And we're far from there, but that seems something that's in reach, at least. For a high performance, so for Morello, for instance, that seems, to me, that seems still far out of reach.
Okay, there is, I think, another question from Dejan. And then I guess we're more or less done with the time. But
So I see the one thing that the industry takes seriously, defense in depth. We're not really focusing on this as a formal community. I'm curious if you think we should. Yes, that's a very, very interesting comment. So actually, this I've heard as a main critique of industry people on formal methods is it's great, but it's one So if it breaks, everything's broken, right? So it's really and then you can say, but yeah, you can't break it because we've proved it. That's not true, right? So for instance, through Rowhammer, to name another kind of attack that I haven't mentioned in the list of attacks on my slide, you might be able to flip a bit and then all the formal verification doesn't give you anything anymore. So it's a very strong but also a single shell. And I think defense in depth is a very, very important thing to think of when we do this kind of validation on real systems. I think as an attack researcher, it'll probably be much harder for me to do anything useful on a system that has multiple layers of defense rather than one that has been fully formally verified. And that's all it has in terms of defenses.
Okay, thanks. I think we're done with the questions. Maybe I have a super quick one.
Shoot.
So I really like this. I mean, I really think that validating formal models is something that critical that we all should do. I mean, a practical challenge here is that, now you have to understand both attacks, let's say microarchitectural attacks, and you have to understand formal methods to validate, which is, I guess, a pretty, pretty diverse skill set. So do you have any thoughts on, how to tackle this?
Yeah, I'm afraid, in my opinion, it's unavoidable to know both. And I agree with you. So I think actually, well, I'm biased, of course. I've been active in this field, in the secure compilation field myself for many years. I think the way in which it's done here, which is essentially, as we learn of new attacks, we understand them and we refine our models by having a lower layer. That's this trend of going down that we've seen, which can model these new attacks that have come up, and then we do all our formal exercise again, and we do it better. I actually think that's a very, very valid and very strong and very good approach. But then at some point, if you want to integrate a system into a real product, you have to make. You can't say. But then at some point you have to decide how much trust can I now put into this, and can I quantify this one way or another? And I don't think that's a formal question anymore. I really think there you need some kind of attack competition, like they have for crypto. In crypto, it's to determine which one becomes the standard. They attack each other, and I think that's unavoidable. If we want to have a reusable RISC-V with security features that can withstand actual use in practice, I think we need also something like a security competition like they have in crypto.
Okay, thanks. So it seems there are no more questions, and we ran out of time for the session. So Frank, thanks again for the very insightful presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation.